The most dangerous mistake you can make in prison is believing that age means weakness. The lunch bell echoed through D Block with the same hollow metallic sound it had made for the last 30 years, rolling through concrete walls and steel bars like distant thunder. Conversations faded. Cards disappeared from tables. Even the men who usually laughed the loudest suddenly found something else to look at. Because Derek "Bull" Callahan was walking toward the cafeteria entrance, and whenever he moved, the rest of the block adjusted around him. At 6'4" and built like a former linebacker, Derek carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. His pale arms were covered with faded tattoos, each one marking another year spent behind walls that had turned harder men into ghosts. Around him walked 4 loyal followers, not because anyone had ordered them to, but because in D-Block survival often looked a lot like obedience. The guards watched from a distance. They always did. Officially, they ran the prison. Unofficially, everyone knew certain problems solved themselves if Derek was allowed to keep his own version of order. Then the old man walked in. He carried his tray with both hands, moving carefully but not slowly, his gray prison uniform hanging loose over a thin frame that looked almost too fragile for the place. His hair was silver, cut close, and his dark skin seemed weathered by a lifetime spent under unforgiving skies. He didn't look left or right. He didn't search for allies. He simply walked forward with the quiet rhythm of someone who had long ago stopped trying to impress anyone. Most of the younger inmates barely noticed him. A few smirked. New arrivals usually did. They saw an old prisoner and imagined an easy target. But one of the older correctional officers standing near the serving line lowered his coffee cup and stared. Officer Frank Donnelly had worked Redstone Correctional Facility for 22 years. He had seen gang leaders come and go. He had seen riots, lockdowns, and enough broken dreams to fill a cemetery. Yet for one brief second, the sight of that old inmate made something deep in his memory stir. There was something about the way the man carried himself. The straight back, the measured breathing, the calm eyes that never wandered. Donnelly frowned, trying to place it, but the thought slipped away before he could catch it. Derek noticed the silence before he noticed the man. His grin spread slowly across his face. "Well, look what wandered into my block," he said loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. A few nervous laughs followed. The old prisoner stopped walking. He looked at Derek for only a second, then continued toward an empty table as though the words belonged to someone else. That made the room even quieter. Derek wasn't used to being ignored. One of his men stepped forward. "Bull's talking to you, old man." Still, no answer. The old prisoner set his tray down with gentle care, adjusted the plastic spoon beside it, and reached for his cup of water. Derek walked over himself now, each step drawing every pair of eyes in the room toward the same place. Mason Reed, a 24-year-old inmate sitting 3 tables away, felt his stomach tighten. He had shared a cell with the old man for 3 nights. In all that time, the stranger had spoken fewer than 20 words. He read old library books, made his bed with perfect corners, woke up before sunrise every morning. And somehow, in a prison where fear smelled stronger than bleach, he never looked afraid. Derek stopped beside the table and rested one hand against it. "I asked you a question." The old prisoner finally looked up. His eyes were calm. Not brave, not angry, just calm. "Did you?" he asked softly. A ripple passed through the cafeteria. Derek laughed, but there was something forced about it now. "You must not understand how things work around here." The old man picked up his cup and took a slow sip of water. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe I understand them better than you think." Officer Donnelly's face lost its color. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory finally started coming into focus, and for the first time in years, the veteran guard felt his hands begin to shake. The silence stayed in the cafeteria long after the old man finished speaking. Nobody reached for a fork. Nobody touched their food. Even the buzzing lights overhead seemed louder than before. Derek Callahan stared at Elijah Brooks, waiting for the old prisoner to look away first. That was how power worked inside D-Block. Someone always blinked. Someone always lowered their eyes. But Elijah simply sat there with one hand resting beside his tray, his expression calm enough to make the entire moment feel strange. Mason Reed had seen men challenge Derek before. Some shouted. Some tried to look tough. Some begged for mercy before the guards even arrived. He had never seen anyone answer with quiet. There was something unsettling about it, like watching a storm approach without a single cloud in the sky. Derek leaned forward slightly. "You think you are funny, old man?" Elijah looked at the younger man with the same patient expression a grandfather might use when listening to a child complain about the weather. "No," he answered. "I think you are carrying more weight than you realize." A few inmates exchanged confused looks. That was not the answer anyone expected. Derek laughed loudly, but the sound did not spread through the room the way it usually did. His crew laughed because they always laughed. Everyone else remained silent. Officer Frank Donnelly could feel his heart beating harder against his chest. He had spent the last few minutes searching through memories that had been buried for years. Training seminars, federal instructors, a demonstration at Quantico almost 2 decades earlier. He remembered standing with a group of correctional officers while a calm older instructor explained that true authority did not come from force. It came from control. The instructor had walked through a room full of armed agents, and nobody had dared interrupt him. Donnelly could not remember the man's full name, but he remembered the eyes. Calm, steady, unshaken, exactly like the old prisoner sitting across from Derek now. The veteran officer took one slow step forward before another guard quietly caught his sleeve. "Leave it alone, Frank," the younger officer whispered. Donnelly did not answer. His attention never left Elijah. Derek rested both hands on the table now. "You must not understand where you are." Elijah nodded once. "I understand exactly where I am." "Then maybe you should start showing some respect." Elijah looked around the cafeteria. He looked at the cracked walls, the faded paint, the tired faces, and the guards standing along the edges pretending not to watch. Then he looked back at Derek. Respect is not something a man demands. It is something other people choose to give him. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Mason noticed 2 of Derek's own followers glance at each other for the briefest moment. The old man had not raised his voice. He had not threatened anyone. Yet somehow the balance in the room felt different. Derek noticed it too. His smile faded. "You think you are better than everyone here?" Elijah slowly shook his head. "No. I think every man gets to decide who he becomes. Some make that choice every day. Others stop trying." The cafeteria fell completely still. Officer Donnelly finally remembered the name. Elijah Brooks, chief instructor for a federal tactical leadership program. Donnelly had attended one 3-day course almost 20 years ago after winning a statewide corrections award. The instructor had been older than most of the agents around him, but nobody questioned his authority. Donnelly remembered one sentence more clearly than anything else. "A calm man can walk into a room full of fear and change the direction of every life inside it." The old officer looked at Elijah again and felt the same chill he had felt back then. Derek thought he was standing over an ordinary old prisoner. But Frank Donnelly suddenly realized that D-Block was about to learn that some legends do not disappear when they grow old. They simply become harder to recognize. The lunch period ended, but the feeling inside D-Block did not leave with the empty trays. It followed the inmates back through the corridors, echoing between the steel bars and concrete walls like a question nobody could answer. Mason Reed walked beside Elijah Brooks in silence. Usually the older man would return to their cell, sit on the lower bunk, and open one of the worn library books stacked beside the wall. Today was no different. Elijah stepped inside, folded the thin prison blanket with careful precision, and opened a weathered copy of The Old Man and the Sea as though nothing unusual had happened. Mason stood there for several seconds before finally speaking. "Do you know who Derek Callahan is?" Elijah turned one page before answering. "I know who he believes he is." Mason let out a nervous laugh. "That is not the same thing." Elijah looked up. "No, it rarely is." Down the corridor, voices moved from cell to cell. Stories always traveled fast in prison, but this one moved faster than most. Some said the old man had been a retired military officer. Others claimed he had worked for the government. One inmate swore he had seen Elijah stop a falling tray without even looking at it earlier that morning. The details changed with every telling, but the ending stayed the same. Derek Callahan had not gotten the reaction he wanted. Inside his own cell, Derek sat quietly on the edge of his bunk. His crew waited for instructions, but none came. They had expected him to make an example of the old prisoner before the day was over. Instead, he simply stared at the gray wall across from him. Finally, one of his followers, a young inmate named Travis Cole, broke the silence. "You want us to handle him?" Derek shook his head. "No." The answer surprised everyone. Derek stood and walked toward the narrow window. I want to know who he is. Across the administration hall, Officer Frank Donnelly sat alone in the security office. An old storage cabinet stood against the back wall, covered with years of dust and forgotten paperwork. He unlocked it with a small brass key and began searching through faded folders and training manuals. The younger officers passing by looked at him with curiosity, but nobody interrupted. Nearly 20 minutes later, Frank found what he was looking for. A group photograph from a federal corrections leadership seminar held 19 years earlier. 30 officers stood in neat rows. In the center was a tall African-American instructor with silver beginning to show around his temples. His posture was perfect, his expression calm. Frank slowly lowered himself into his chair. The name printed beneath the picture had almost faded away, but it was still there. Elijah Brooks, Chief Tactical Instructor, Federal Training Division. Frank looked toward the security monitors that showed different parts of D Block. One screen displayed Elijah sitting quietly on his bunk reading. The old officer felt the same strange feeling he had carried all afternoon. Respect. Not because of strength. Not because of fear. Because the man on that screen looked exactly the same as he had 2 decades earlier. Calm. Focused. Completely in control of himself. Warden Thomas Harper stepped into the office and noticed the photograph. What are you looking at? Frank handed him the picture without saying a word. The warden studied it for a moment. You know this man? Frank nodded slowly. I met him once. Who was he? Frank looked back at the monitor. Elijah had just closed his book and was staring quietly through the bars toward the fading afternoon light. The better question, Frank said softly, is who taught the people that protect this country? The warden frowned. You think it is really him? Frank did not answer right away. Somewhere down in D Block, the evening count bell began to ring. Doors closed one after another with sharp metallic echoes. Elijah stood beside his bunk, hands folded in front of him, waiting for the count like every other prisoner. But Frank Donnelly suddenly realized something that made his stomach tighten. The old man was not adjusting to life inside the prison. Somehow, without saying more than a few quiet sentences, the prison itself was beginning to adjust to him. Morning arrived at Redstone Correctional Facility the way it always did, with the sound of steel doors unlocking one after another and tired voices calling out the daily count. But something had changed overnight. Mason Reed noticed it the moment he and Elijah Brooks stepped into the corridor. Men who had ignored the old prisoner before were watching him now. Some nodded quietly. Others simply moved out of his way without realizing they were doing it. Rumors had a strange life inside prison walls. They grew while people slept. By breakfast, 3 different versions of Elijah's past were already moving through D Block. One inmate claimed the old man had been a decorated Marine. Another insisted he had worked undercover for the government. A third swore Elijah had once trained an entire police academy somewhere back east. Nobody knew the truth, but nobody laughed anymore. Elijah seemed completely unaware of the attention. He walked at the same steady pace as always, carrying his tray with both hands, stopping only long enough to let another inmate pass through the serving line first. Mason finally shook his head. You hear what they are saying about you? Elijah placed a piece of toast on his tray before answering. People usually create stories when they do not have facts. So none of it is true. Elijah looked at him with a faint smile. Does it matter? Mason opened his mouth, then closed it again. Somehow that answer felt bigger than the question. Across the cafeteria, Derek Callahan watched the exchange without touching his breakfast. Travis Cole leaned toward him. You want me to find out where he came from? Derek kept his eyes on Elijah. I already asked around. And nobody knows. Travis frowned. Everybody knows something about everybody in here. Derek slowly stood. That is exactly what bothers me. Officer Frank Donnelly had barely slept. The old photograph was still sitting on his desk in the security office. He had looked at it a dozen times before sunrise, hoping he was wrong. But every glance brought the same answer. The man in the picture and the old prisoner in D Block were one and the same. Warden Thomas Harper entered carrying a cup of black coffee. You are still thinking about him. Frank handed him the photograph again. I called an old friend last night. He attended that federal program with me. The warden studied Frank's face. What did he say? Frank hesitated. He said there were instructors who taught defensive tactics. There were instructors who taught leadership. Then there was Elijah Brooks. The office fell quiet. What made him different? Frank looked through the glass toward the cell blocks. My friend said the agents respected him because he never acted like the smartest man in the room. Somehow, everyone else reached that conclusion on their own. At that same moment, Elijah reached an empty table near the back wall and sat down. The noise of the cafeteria slowly returned, but it sounded different now. Less like chaos, more like people waiting for something they could not explain. Derek finally walked across the room. His crew started to follow, but he lifted one hand, stopping them. He wanted this conversation for himself. Mason noticed him coming and felt his pulse quicken. Elijah simply unfolded the napkin beside his tray. Derek stopped across the table. I asked around about you. Elijah nodded once. Did you find what you were looking for? Derek studied the old man's face. No. Elijah looked down at his coffee before answering. That happens more often than you might think. Derek rested both hands on the table. You have been here less than a week, and people are already talking about you. Elijah slowly looked up. People talk because silence makes them uncomfortable. Derek stared at him, waiting for fear, anger, or even arrogance. Instead, he found something else entirely. Peace. Real peace. The kind that did not depend on who had power or who controlled the room. For the first time in years, Derek Callahan realized he was standing across from a man who was not trying to win anything at all. And somehow, that unsettled him more than any challenge ever could. That afternoon, a cold rain began falling outside the prison walls, tapping softly against the narrow windows that lined the upper corridor of D Block. Most of the inmates never noticed weather anymore. Days blended together behind concrete and steel until seasons felt like stories from another life. But Elijah Brooks paused for a moment beside the window as the block moved toward the library period. He watched the rain with the same quiet expression he seemed to carry everywhere. Mason Reed slowed his steps. You miss it? He asked. Elijah looked outside a second longer. Rain reminds people that the world keeps moving, even when they think it has stopped. Mason looked through the glass at the gray sky. I stopped thinking about the outside a long time ago. Elijah nodded gently. That is how walls become stronger than bars. The words stayed with Mason as they entered the library. The room was small, filled with old shelves and worn paperbacks that had passed through thousands of hands. Most inmates came there simply because it was quieter than the cell block. Elijah walked directly to one shelf and returned an old history book before choosing another. The librarian, an elderly volunteer named Mrs. Evelyn Carter, smiled when she saw him. Finished already? Elijah smiled back. Good books deserve to be read more than once. She laughed softly. I used to tell my students the same thing. Mason had never seen anyone in prison speak to staff that way. Not because they were trying to impress them, simply because they were being kind. Across the room, Derek Callahan stood near the magazine rack. He had followed them without saying a word. Travis Cole stepped beside him. That old guy is making people forget who runs this place. Derek watched Elijah speaking with Mrs. Carter. No, he answered quietly. He is making people remember something else. Travis frowned. What is that? Derek did not answer because he did not know. All he knew was that every conversation with the old prisoner left him feeling as though he had missed something important. In the administration building, Officer Frank Donnelly sat with Warden Thomas Harper reviewing old personnel records from the federal seminar. The file was thin, almost empty. There were no awards listed, no long biography, just a name and a position. Elijah Brooks, Chief Tactical Instructor. Frank shook his head. That never made sense to me. The warden looked up. What did not? The best instructors usually have walls covered with medals. He had almost nothing. Warden Harper folded his arms. Maybe he was just a good teacher. Frank looked at the photograph one more time. No, men like that do not earn respect because of titles. They earn it because people trust them. The warden leaned back in his chair. Then why is he here? Frank slowly closed the file. I have been asking myself that since yesterday. Back in the library, Mrs. Carter placed a book into Elijah's hands. It was an old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird with a faded blue cover. Elijah looked at it for a long moment. A classic, he said. Mrs. Carter smiled. Some stories survive because they remind people who they are supposed to be. Derek had moved closer without realizing it. He watched the old man carefully. There was no performance, no act. Elijah simply thanked the volunteer and turned toward the exit. As he walked past Derek, the gang leader spoke almost without thinking. Why do you always act like none of this bothers you? Elijah stopped. The corridor outside the library had gone completely quiet. Mason looked at Derek. Travis looked at Elijah. Even Mrs. Carter paused behind her desk. Elijah turned slowly toward the younger man. His voice was calm, almost gentle, because a man spends his whole life choosing what deserves his attention. Derek held his stare. And what deserves yours? Elijah looked down at the old book in his hands before answering. People who still have time to become better than they were yesterday. Derek said nothing. Elijah walked away, disappearing into the long gray corridor while the rain continued tapping against the windows. And for reasons he could not explain, Derek Callahan stood perfectly still, wondering why the words of one quiet old prisoner sounded more powerful than all the threats he had heard in his entire life. That night the lights inside D Block dimmed at exactly 10 o'clock, but very few men actually slept. Rain still drifted against the narrow windows, and somewhere far beyond the prison walls thunder rolled across the hills. Mason Reed lay on the upper bunk staring at the ceiling. Below him, Elijah Brooks sat with his back against the wall, the old blue novel resting in his lap. He had not turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. He simply listened to the quiet sounds of the block settling into the night. Finally, Mason spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Elijah looked up. "You already are." Mason smiled for the first time that day. "Were you always this calm?" Elijah looked toward the small window at the end of the cell. "No." "Then what changed?" The old man thought for a moment. "I realized that most of the things people fear never actually happen. And the things that do happen cannot always be changed by worrying about them." Mason folded his hands behind his head. "That sounds like something a teacher would say." Elijah's eyes drifted back to the book. "Maybe I spent too much time around students." Mason wanted to ask another question, but the evening count interrupted him. Guards moved through the corridor, checking each cell with practiced routine. Officer Frank Donnelly reached their door and paused longer than necessary. Elijah stood quietly like every other inmate. Their eyes met for only a second. Frank gave the smallest nod before moving on. Mason noticed it immediately. "He knows you, does he not?" Elijah waited until the footsteps faded down the hall. "We met once." "Where?" Elijah closed the book. "A long time ago." Across the block, Derek Callahan sat alone at a metal table bolted to the floor of his cell. Travis Cole had finally stopped asking questions, but Derek could still hear the whispers moving through the corridors. Men who had once looked at him for answers were now talking about the old prisoner. He hated rumors because they created something he could not control. He had built his place in D Block by making sure everyone understood the rules. Strength mattered. Confidence mattered. Reputation mattered. But Elijah Brooks seemed to follow none of those rules, and somehow people listened to him anyway. Derek stood and walked to the bars. One of the night guards passed by. "How long has that old guy been here?" The guard barely looked up from his clipboard. "A few days." "What is he in for?" "I do not know." Derek frowned. "You work here." The guard shrugged. "Some files stay locked." That answer stayed with Derek long after the guard disappeared. "Some files stay locked." In the administration office, Warden Thomas Harper sat alone reviewing Elijah's intake paperwork for the fourth time. The file was ordinary. Age, height, weight, sentence information, medical records. Nothing stood out. Yet the old photograph from Frank Donnelly's seminar sat beside it like a piece from a completely different puzzle. The warden reached for the phone and dialed a number he had not called in years. After 3 rings, a voice answered. "Federal Training Division." Harper hesitated. "I need to ask about a former instructor." There was a brief silence. "Name?" The warden looked at the photograph. "Elijah Brooks." The woman on the other end did not answer immediately. Papers shuffled softly in the background. Then her voice returned, quieter than before. "May I ask why you are requesting that information?" Harper looked through the office window toward the dark outline of D Block. "Because I think he is an inmate in my prison." Another silence followed. Longer this time. Finally, the woman spoke. "Please hold." The line clicked. Harper waited. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. When the voice returned, it was not the same person. It belonged to a man, older, calm, and carefully controlled. "This is Deputy Director Victor Hale. Tell me exactly where you said Elijah Brooks is." Harper slowly lowered himself into his chair. Outside, another roll of thunder crossed the sky above Redstone Correctional Facility. Deep inside D Block, Elijah Brooks closed his eyes for the night, completely unaware that a single phone call had just awakened memories far beyond the prison walls. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the sky above Redstone clear and cold. Thin beams of sunlight slipped through the narrow windows of D Block, painting long bars of light across the concrete floor. Elijah Brooks was already awake when the first bell sounded. Mason Reed climbed down from the top bunk and found the old man quietly making his bed with careful precision, every corner folded exactly the same way. "Do you ever sleep?" Mason asked. Elijah smiled faintly. "Enough." Mason rubbed his eyes. "You always seem ready for the day." Elijah looked toward the window. "A man who spends his life waiting for tomorrow eventually forgets how to live today." Mason had heard dozens of strange sayings since they became cellmates, but somehow each one stayed with him longer than he expected. As they walked toward breakfast, something felt different. The whispers had not disappeared overnight. They had grown louder. Inmates who had never spoken to Elijah before gave him a respectful nod. One older prisoner stepped aside to let him pass through the corridor first. Elijah thanked him with a simple smile and kept walking. Derek Callahan noticed everything. He stood near the cafeteria entrance watching the old prisoner move through the crowd without asking for attention and somehow receiving it anyway. Travis Cole walked beside him. "People are acting strange." Derek kept his eyes on Elijah. "No, they are watching." "Watching for what?" Derek answered without turning his head. "I'm trying to figure that out myself." Across the prison, Warden Thomas Harper had been sitting in his office since sunrise. The phone conversation from the night before refused to leave his mind. Deputy Director Victor Hale had not asked why Elijah Brooks was in prison. He had not asked what crime he committed. His first question had been whether Elijah was safe. Harper had spent 25 years working corrections. He had spoken with judges, governors, and federal officials. Very few people carried themselves the way Victor Hale had over the telephone. The respect in the man's voice had been impossible to miss. A knock came at the office door. Officer Frank Donnelly stepped inside, carrying the old seminar photograph. "I thought you should have this." Harper looked at the picture again. "You still think it is him?" Frank nodded. "I know it is him." The warden folded his arms. "Tell me about that training." Frank leaned against the desk and stared at the faded image. There were almost 100 officers and federal agents there. Everybody expected some loud instructor who wanted to prove he was the toughest man in the room. Harper listened quietly. Then Elijah Brooks walked in. Frank smiled to himself. He did not raise his voice once. He never told anyone he was important. But after 10 minutes, every person in that building was listening to him. Why? Frank took a slow breath. Because he treated everyone the same. New recruit, veteran agent, custodian. It did not matter. He looked at people like they mattered. Harper glanced toward the window overlooking the prison yard. "And now he is here." Frank nodded. "That is the part one cannot understand." In the cafeteria, Elijah sat at the same table as always. He unfolded his napkin, placed it beside his tray, and reached for his coffee. Before he could take a sip, a shadow crossed the table. Derek Callahan stood there. This time he had come alone. The room slowly grew quiet. Mason looked around and realized dozens of inmates were pretending not to watch. Derek pulled out the empty chair across from Elijah and sat down. Nobody could remember the last time the leader of D Block had asked permission to sit with anyone. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Derek looked at the old prisoner. "I have been trying to understand you." Elijah lifted his cup. "How is that going?" Derek almost smiled. "Not very well." Elijah nodded as though he expected that answer. Derek leaned forward slightly. "People say you used to be somebody." Elijah looked into his coffee before answering. "Everybody used to be somebody." Derek shook his head. "That is not what I mean." Elijah finally met his eyes. The old man's voice stayed soft, but somehow every word carried across the silent cafeteria. "The world spends too much time asking what a man once was. It forgets to ask what kind of person he chooses to be today." Derek looked at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked away. As the noise slowly returned to the room, Mason stared after him in disbelief. The most feared man in D Block had come looking for answers, and somehow he had left with even more questions than before. By late afternoon, the entire prison seemed to be moving a little slower. The tension that had settled over D Block was impossible to explain, but everyone could feel it. Guards spoke more quietly. Inmates watched each other more carefully. Even the usual arguments over card games and television channels faded into the background. It was as though the block itself was waiting for something to happen. Elijah Brooks spent the recreation period exactly the way he spent every other hour of the day. He sat on a weathered bench in the yard with a library book resting on one knee, while the cool autumn wind carried dry leaves across the cracked pavement. Mason Reed sat beside him, trying to read his own novel, but his eyes kept drifting toward the old man. "Can I ask you another question?" Mason finally said. Elijah closed the book and looked at him. "You usually do." Mason smiled. "Were you really a teacher?" Elijah looked across the yard where a few inmates were walking slow circles around the track. "I spent many years helping people prepare for difficult days." Mason frowned. "Police?" Elijah was quiet for a moment. "Some wore badges. Some did not. In the end, they were all just people trying to make good decisions under pressure." Mason wanted to know more, but he had already learned that Elijah never lied. He simply answered only the part of the question that mattered. Across the yard, Derek Callahan watched from the handball court. Travis Cole stepped beside him. "You have been giving that old man too much attention." Derek folded his arms. "Maybe everybody else has been giving him too little." Travis looked confused. "You really think he is somebody important?" Derek kept his eyes on Elijah. "I think there is a reason even the guards look different when they see him." At that exact moment, Officer Frank Donnelly appeared near the yard entrance. He was not scheduled for outside duty, yet there he was, quietly observing the same old prisoner for the third time that day. Derek noticed it immediately. Frank had spent years avoiding unnecessary contact with inmates. Now he seemed unable to take his eyes off one man. Inside the administration building, Warden Thomas Harper ended another phone call. Deputy Director Victor Hale had not shared many details, but he had made one request very clear. He wanted to visit Redstone personally, as soon as possible. Harper stared out the office window toward the yard below. He had asked Victor one final question before hanging up. What kind of instructor was Elijah Brooks? The answer still echoed in his mind. The kind who never told people to become stronger. He taught them to become better. Harper had heard thousands of people described over the years. Dangerous, intelligent, ruthless, brilliant. Nobody had ever used that word before. Better. Back in the yard, the recreation whistle sounded. Inmates slowly lined up to return inside. Elijah stood from the bench and gently brushed a few leaves from the cover of his book before handing it to Mason. "Would you carry this for me?" Mason looked surprised. "Sure." Elijah smiled. "Thank you." As they reached the corridor leading back into D Block, an elderly maintenance worker pushing a supply cart lost control of a small stack of boxes. Papers scattered across the floor. Cleaning supplies rolled in different directions. Most inmates simply walked around the mess. Elijah stepped out of line without hesitation, knelt down, and began gathering everything together. Mason joined him. After a second, another inmate helped. Then another. Within moments, half a dozen prisoners were quietly picking up the scattered supplies. The old maintenance worker looked around in disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered. Elijah handed him the last box. "Everybody needs help once in a while." Officer Frank Donnelly had watched the entire thing from the end of the hallway. His eyes slowly drifted toward Derek Callahan. The gang leader had never moved. He simply stood there looking at Elijah with an expression Frank had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not fear. It looked almost like respect. As the heavy steel doors closed behind the returning inmates, Frank suddenly remembered something Elijah Brooks had said during that federal seminar 19 years ago. Real leaders do not force people to follow them. They simply remind others who they could become. And standing in that gray prison corridor, Frank realized that was exactly what was happening. The following morning arrived with a strange kind of quiet. The usual noise of D Block was still there, steel doors opening, officers calling out instructions, trays sliding across cafeteria counters, but underneath it all was something new. It felt as though the entire prison had started listening. Mason Reed noticed it before breakfast. As he and Elijah Brooks walked down the corridor, inmates who normally filled the air with jokes and loud conversations stepped aside without being asked. Nobody spoke to Elijah. They simply watched him pass. Mason looked around nervously. "Do you see that?" Elijah kept walking. People notice different things when they slowed down. Mason shook his head. "No, they are watching you." Elijah smiled faintly. "Perhaps they are looking for something they already have." That answer stayed with Mason as they entered the cafeteria. The room was nearly full, but the table near the back wall where Elijah always sat was empty, almost as though everyone had silently agreed it belonged to him now. Elijah carried his tray over and sat down without noticing. Mason followed. Across the room, Derek Callahan stood beside Travis Cole with his arms folded. He had spent most of the night awake, replaying every conversation he had shared with the old prisoner. None of it made sense. Elijah never challenged him, never argued, never tried to prove he was important. Yet somehow Derek felt as though he was the one being measured every time they spoke. Travis leaned closer. "You cannot keep letting this happen." Derek did not look away from Elijah. "What exactly is happening?" Travis lowered his voice. "People are changing." Derek watched as one young inmate quietly carried an extra carton of milk over to an older prisoner who usually ate alone. Another man helped someone with a walking cane find a seat. Small things, ordinary things. Yet they had become more common since Elijah arrived. Derek finally answered. "Maybe they are remembering something." Travis frowned. "What?" Derek took a slow breath. "How to act like human beings." The word surprised even him. At that same moment, Warden Thomas Harper stood near the front entrance of the prison with Officer Frank Donnelly. A black government vehicle had just pulled into the parking lot. Neither man spoke as the driver stepped out and opened the rear door. A tall, silver-haired gentleman in a dark suit climbed out carrying a single leather briefcase. Frank recognized him immediately from old photographs. Deputy Director Victor Hale. The federal official looked toward the prison building, then back at Harper. "Thank you for calling me." Harper extended his hand. "I wish I understood why I did." Victor shook his hand politely. "I believe I can explain that." As they walked toward the administration office, Frank stayed a few steps behind. He watched Victor Hale carefully. The man had the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying responsibility. Yet when he asked his next question, his voice softened in a way Frank had never expected. "How is Elijah doing?" Harper glanced at him. "He seems peaceful." Victor smiled to himself. "That sounds like him." Back in the cafeteria, Mason noticed Elijah looking through the window toward the prison yard. "What are you thinking about?" Elijah looked at the clear blue sky above the fence. "I used to tell my students that every difficult day eventually ends." Mason laughed quietly. "Did they believe you?" Elijah turned back toward him. "Not at first." Before Mason could answer, Officer Donnelly appeared at the cafeteria entrance. His eyes met Elijah's for only a second before he looked away. But Mason saw something that made him sit up straighter. The veteran officer gave the old prisoner the smallest respectful nod. Elijah returned it just as quietly. Nothing else happened. No words. No explanation. Yet Derek Callahan saw it too. He watched one of the toughest officers in Redstone Correctional Facility acknowledge an old inmate with the kind of respect usually reserved for a commander. For the first time since Elijah Brooks arrived, Derek felt a question rise in his mind that he could not push away. If a man like Frank Donnelly looked at the old prisoner that way, then who had Elijah Brooks really been before the prison gates closed behind him? The news of the visitor spread through the administration offices long before it reached the cell blocks. Deputy Director Victor Hale walked through Redstone Correctional Facility with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life making difficult decisions. He was greeted by wardens, supervisors, and senior officers, yet he seemed interested in only one thing. Warden Thomas Harper led him into the conference room and placed Elijah Brooks's intake file on the table. Victor looked at it, but never opened it. Harper noticed immediately. "You do not want to see why he is here." Victor slowly shook his head. "I already know the kind of man he is." Frank Donnelly stood silently near the door. The old officer had waited almost 20 years to understand why one forgotten seminar still lived in his memory. Victor finally looked at him. "You trained under him?" Frank nodded once. "Only for 3 days." Victor smiled faintly. 3 days was enough for most people. Harper folded his arms. "I have to ask, who exactly was Elijah Brooks?" Victor was quiet for several seconds. Through the conference room window, they could see the prison yard below where inmates were slowly crossing toward the afternoon work assignments. Finally, Victor answered. "When young agents arrived at the academy, they thought they needed to become fearless. Elijah taught them that courage was not the absence of fear. It was doing the right thing while fear was standing beside you." Frank lowered his eyes. He remembered those exact words. Victor continued. "Some instructors teach procedures. Some teach tactics. Elijah taught character." Harper glanced at the untouched file. "Then why does almost nobody know his name?" Victor looked toward the yard. "Because he never wanted them to." At that same moment, Elijah Brooks was helping Mason organize a cart of library books outside the education wing. The old prisoner handled each book with care, dusting off worn covers before placing them back on the shelves. Mason looked at him and finally asked the question that had been sitting in his mind for days. If you really spent your life teaching people, why are you helping sort old books in a prison library? Elijah smiled without looking up. Because books and people have something in common. Mason waited. Sometimes they are judged by the cover before anyone discovers what is inside. Mason laughed softly. You always answer questions with another lesson. Elijah placed the last book on the cart. That is because lessons last longer than answers. Across the yard, Derek Callahan watched the two men from a distance. Travis Cole stepped beside him again. The federal guy is here. Derek looked toward the administration building where black government vehicles stood parked outside. I know. Do you think he came for the old man? Derek did not answer immediately. He watched Elijah help another inmate lift a heavy box onto the cart, then quietly thank him afterward. Nothing about the old prisoner matched the stories Derek had grown up believing about strength. Yet somehow every day Elijah seemed to become harder to ignore. Travis lowered his voice. You think he was some kind of agent? Derek slowly shook his head. No. Then what? Derek looked at the administration windows high above the yard. He could just make out three figures standing inside, watching the old prisoner below. One of them was the deputy director himself. The most powerful visitor Redstone had seen in years had not come to inspect the prison. He had come to see one quiet old inmate carrying library books. Derek felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a very long while, he realized that the strongest man he had ever met might be the one who never tried to prove it at all. The afternoon work period ended early that day, but nobody inside D Block seemed eager to leave the yard. Word had spread that an important federal official was somewhere inside the prison, and rumors moved through the blocks faster than the cold wind that swept across the concrete. Mason Reed walked beside Elijah Brooks, carrying the same stack of library books they had been organizing all morning. Do you think he came for somebody here? Mason asked. Elijah adjusted one of the books before answering. Important people usually come because they believe something matters. Mason looked toward the administration building. Then somebody must matter a lot. Elijah smiled gently. Everybody matters to someone. High above the yard, behind the glass windows of the administration office, Deputy Director Victor Hale stood silently watching the old prisoner below. Warden Thomas Harper and Officer Frank Donnelly stood beside him, waiting for him to speak. Victor rested one hand against the window. He still walks the same way. Harper glanced toward Elijah. You have not seen him in years? Victor slowly shook his head. Almost 15. Frank looked surprised. I thought you worked together. Victor smiled faintly. Nobody worked beside Elijah Brooks. We all worked after him. Harper frowned. I do not understand. Victor looked away from the yard and toward the two men beside him. When I was 24 years old, I believed being an agent meant learning how to outthink criminals and survive dangerous situations. Elijah taught me something different. Frank remained silent. Victor's voice grew softer. He said the hardest part of wearing a badge was remembering that every person you meet is carrying a story you cannot see. Harper looked back through the window. Elijah had stopped walking because one of the older inmates had dropped a pair of reading glasses onto the pavement. Without hesitation, the old prisoner bent down, picked them up carefully, and handed them back with a smile. The inmate thanked him quietly before walking away. Victor watched the small moment with tired eyes. That is who he has always been. Down in the yard, Derek Callahan had seen it too. He noticed the old inmate helping people without expecting anything in return. He noticed the guards treating him differently. Most of all, he noticed the black government vehicles parked outside the prison fence. Travis Cole stepped beside him. That federal guy has been staring at the old man for almost 20 minutes. Derek nodded. I know. Who do you think Elijah really is? Derek looked across the yard where Elijah and Mason had reached the library entrance. The old prisoner stopped and held the door open for 3 other inmates before walking inside himself. Derek let out a slow breath. I think he spent his whole life becoming the kind of man everybody else wishes they had met sooner. Inside the library, Elijah placed the books back onto the shelves while Mrs. Evelyn Carter smiled at him from behind the desk. You seem to have made quite an impression around here. Elijah looked at the rows of old books. Prisons are not so different from libraries. Mrs. Carter laughed softly. How could that possibly be? Elijah picked up a worn novel with faded pages. Both places are full of people waiting for someone to believe there is more to them than what others see. Mrs. Carter lowered her eyes for a moment. Before she could answer, the library door opened. Officer Frank Donnelly stepped inside. The veteran guard removed his cap and held it in both hands. Mason had never seen anything like it. Frank walked directly toward Elijah and stopped only a few feet away. The room became completely silent. Mrs. Carter looked up from her desk. Mason froze beside the bookshelf. Even Derek, standing in the hallway outside, noticed the old officer through the glass window. Frank looked at Elijah for several long seconds before speaking. "Sir," he said quietly, "I was hoping you would remember me." Elijah studied the older guard's face. Then a warm smile slowly appeared. "Frank Donnelly," he answered. "You finally learned that patience is harder than strength." The old officer's eyes filled with emotion as he gave the smallest respectful nod. And standing outside the library door, Derek Callahan realized that the quiet old prisoner he had tried so hard to understand had just been recognized by a man who had spent his entire career protecting others. The library remained silent long after Officer Frank Donnelly spoke Elijah Brooks's name. Mason Reed looked from one man to the other, trying to understand what he was seeing. The toughest correctional officer in Redstone was standing with his cap in his hands, looking at an old prisoner with the kind of respect most people reserved for family. Elijah stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "You have done well," he said quietly. Frank lowered his eyes. "I tried to remember what you taught us." Elijah smiled. "Then you already know that trying matters more than succeeding." Mrs. Evelyn Carter looked at the two men in disbelief. Derek Callahan remained outside the library door, unable to move. Travis Cole whispered from behind him, but Derek barely heard the words. His attention never left Elijah. The old prisoner was not acting like someone who had been discovered. He looked exactly the same as he had every day since arriving at Redstone. Calm, patient, unchanged. Up in the administration office, Deputy Director Victor Hale finally stood from his chair. Warden Thomas Harper looked at him. "You are going down there?" Victor nodded. "I should have done it the moment I arrived." Harper walked with him through the long hallway leading toward the education wing. Frank's radio message had already reached the front office. Staff members quietly stepped aside as the two men passed. None of them understood what was happening, but they could all feel that something important was about to unfold. Inside the library, Elijah was placing books back onto the shelves as though nothing unusual had happened. Mason finally gathered enough courage to speak. "You really taught Officer Donnelly?" Elijah slid one final book into place. "For a few days." Mason looked confused. "Then why did he look at you like that?" Elijah turned toward him. Sometimes people are grateful for lessons they did not understand until years later. Before Mason could answer, the library door opened once again. The room fell completely still. Deputy Director Victor Hale stepped inside wearing the same dark suit, carrying the same leather briefcase, but the expression on his face had changed. The confident federal official who had walked into Redstone that morning was gone. In his place stood a man looking at someone he had not seen in many years. Elijah slowly turned. For a brief second, neither man spoke. Mason glanced toward Officer Donnelly, who had quietly stepped back against the wall. Mrs. Carter removed her glasses. Even Derek Callahan found himself holding his breath outside the doorway. Victor Hale took 2 slow steps forward. Then, to the complete surprise of everyone watching, he stopped and lowered his head. "Sir," he said softly, "it has been far too long." The word echoed through the library. "Sir." Not Elijah. Not Mr. Brooks. "Sir." Warden Harper stood frozen near the entrance. He had seen governors visit prisons. He had seen judges and senators inspect correctional facilities. He had never seen a federal leader greet anyone with that kind of respect. Elijah looked at Victor for a long moment before smiling. "You kept your promise." Victor's eyes reflected memories that nobody else in the room could see. "You told us that one day people would forget our titles, our awards, and our positions. They would only remember how we treated them." Elijah nodded gently. "And did you remember?" Victor smiled. "Every single day." Derek Callahan felt the ground beneath everything he believed begin to shift. The old prisoner he had tried to understand was not simply a former instructor. The deputy director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was standing in a prison library speaking to him like a student greeting the teacher who had changed his life. Mason looked at Elijah with completely different eyes now, But the old man himself had not changed at all. He simply reached for another worn book and handed it to Mrs. Carter with a quiet smile. Someone else might need this story now. And in that moment, everyone inside the room realized that Elijah Brooks had never cared whether people knew who he had been. He had only cared about the kind of people they could still become. The days that followed felt different inside Redstone Correctional Facility. Nobody announced what had happened in the library, yet somehow everyone seemed to know. Guards who had spent years walking the corridors with hard expressions now paused long enough to ask inmates how they were doing. Men who had not spoken to one another in months began sharing tables during meals. It was not a miracle, and it was not perfection, but something had shifted. Mason Reed noticed it more than anyone. He walked beside Elijah Brooks through the morning count and quietly said, "I think you changed this place." Elijah looked around the block before answering. People change places. One person simply reminds them they can. Mason smiled. "You always make it sound easy." Elijah returned the smile. "The right thing is often simple. It is not always easy." Across the cafeteria, Derek Callahan sat alone. Travis Cole had stopped asking questions days ago. There was nothing left to say. Derek watched Elijah help one of the older inmates carry his tray to the table before sitting down himself. The old prisoner had never challenged Derek. He had never asked for respect. Somehow he had earned it without trying. Derek slowly stood and walked across the room. Conversations faded as he approached. Mason looked up nervously, but Elijah simply folded his hands on the table and waited. Derek stopped in front of him. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Derek looked down and said, "I spent my whole life thinking people listened because they were afraid." Elijah studied the younger man carefully. "And what do you think now?" Derek glanced around the room. Men who had once followed him out of fear were watching him quietly. "I think fear only lasts until somebody stronger comes along." Elijah nodded gently. "Respect lasts much longer." Derek lowered his eyes. "I do not know if I have ever earned that." Elijah's voice remained calm. "Then today is a good day to start." Mason watched as Derek gave a small nod before quietly walking away. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. But every man in the cafeteria understood they had just seen something they would remember for the rest of their lives. In the administration building, Deputy Director Victor Hale prepared to leave. Warden Thomas Harper walked him to the front entrance. "I still do not understand one thing," Harper admitted. Victor looked toward the cell blocks. "What is that?" Harper folded his hands behind his back. With everything he accomplished, why did he never tell anyone who he was? Victor smiled as though he had expected the question. "Because Elijah believed that if people only respected your title, they never really knew you." Harper looked out across the prison yard where Elijah and Mason were heading toward the library once again. "Do you think he knows what he has done here?" Victor watched the old instructor disappear through the doorway. He never cared about changing buildings. He cared about changing people. Before stepping into his vehicle, Victor reached into his briefcase and handed Harper the faded photograph from the old federal seminar. Dozens of young officers and agents stood together, but the man in the center looked exactly the same as he did today. Calm, steady, unshaken. On the back of the photograph, written in neat handwriting, was a single sentence. Harper read it quietly to himself. "A person's greatest strength is not the power to stand above others. It is the courage to help others stand beside you." That evening, as the final count echoed through D Block, Elijah Brooks stood by the small window in his cell looking at the sunset beyond the fences. Mason sat on the lower bunk holding the old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that Elijah had lent him. "Do you think people can really change?" Mason asked softly. Elijah looked toward the fading light and smiled. "I spent my whole life believing they could." The last rays of the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, and the steel doors closed one by one across the prison. Yet somehow the walls did not seem quite as heavy anymore, because one quiet old prisoner had reminded everyone inside them that true strength was never about making another person kneel. It was about helping them find the courage to stand.